Let's see if it works them up here. Okay, let's get started. When I was younger, I had a duck as a pet. I loved that duck. It was beautiful, very, very lovely. One morning, I came downstairs and my duck was just laying there. And it wouldn't move no matter what I did to try and help it feel a little better. So I took it to the hospital and to the vet, and I said to the vet, "What's wrong with my duck?" And he said, "I'm sorry to tell you this, but your duck is dead." I said, "Could I have a second opinion?" So he said, sure. He walked to the back of his office and he opened a door and this black Labrador walked in, very intelligent looking dog. And the dog walked over to my duck and sniffed it from beak to feet, shook its head sadly and said, "Oh." Doctor said, "I'm sorry, your duck is dead." I said, "Could I have a third opinion?" And the doctor said, sure. So he went and he opened the back door of his office and in came this incredibly intelligent cat. The cat walked over to my duck and sniffed it from bill to feet and shook its head sadly. The doctor said, "I'm sorry, your duck is dead." I said, "I guess I have to accept it. Can you give me the bill?" And he said, "Well, it's $1,500. I said, $1,500 to tell me my duck was dead? He said, "Well, if you had accepted my original diagnosis, it would have been $20. But you required a CAT scan and a lab report." We are doing a seminar, an anxiety workshop, recognizing and managing excessive fear. Recognizing it is a key part. Really being able to name what's going on. We're going to be talking a little bit about titling it and understanding in the big picture what anxiety actually is, and in some sense, what it's not. And then what to do about it. How do you manage that level of anxiety that you might be experiencing or working with people that are experiencing anxiety? I'm Dr. Myke Merrill. I wrote a book called Why Do People Act That Way? And What Can I Do About It? Both of those questions are extremely important. It's available on Amazon. I have 5 copies back there if you're interested in that. Why do people act that way is a question that is so frequently asked about everything. People pull out in front of you when there's space behind you and they just jam their car out into the road and you go, why do people do that? I mean, it just seems so bizarre and inexplicable. But the second question perhaps is even more important than the first question is, what can I do about it? Not what do I have to do about it or what might I do about it, but what can I actually do about it? I'm the lead pastor here at Parma Christian Fellowship Church, and I co-host a podcast called Gripping Reality with my friend on the West Coast, Mike Wilson. In very, very brief, I want to cover the big territory first and show you where I see anxiety coming in the big picture of reality. Mike and I have been colleagues for decades, 35, 36 years. And as we have worked with students, with parents, with staff, with law enforcement, with all kinds of people across the country and even around the world, one of the concepts that we developed to help people understand themselves and be able to put some words to reality that they may not be able to express and even think about, much less resolve. And we came up with this graphic. It goes in clockwise order of perceptions, emotions, motivations, and behaviors. And I'll explain a little bit about this. We're not going to spend, there's so much content I could literally teach for 3 days and we would just be getting into the depth of this. But we see that there are 4 complexes in every human being. They're all over the board in terms of strengths and weaknesses, in terms of intensity, in terms of resilience, in terms of engagement, how they interact with each other. But these four, just being able to come up with some language to capture a concept, which is really quite difficult to understand at times, we put it into this graphic. And the four heads, the way they're blended, is an important part of the conversation. So what I would like you to do is be interactive with me tonight. And the way to do that is to take your phone and to text from your phone to the number 22333. That's the number you're texting to, not a 10-digit number, just about those 5 numbers, 22333. And the text of the message you are sending is Dr. Dr. Myke, M-Y-K-E-M, don't forget the M, 633. Dr. M-Y-K-E-M 633. And when you do that correctly, it doesn't matter whether you use capitals or not, you'll get a response from the system saying you have logged on to Dr. Myke Merrill and you're ready to go. So go ahead and type yourself in there and see if you can get that message back that says you're logged in. So in order to see if it actually worked or not, I have a practice question for you so that you can answer, and I'll teach you not only how do you give an answer, but how do you undo your answer and change it if you want to. There are 5 kinds of people. There are those people who would be considered dog people. Not that they themselves are a dog, but the animal that they really like the most is a dog. There are people who are cat people. Sometimes they're both, but most people have a preference one to the other. There are some people who are songbird people. There are people who are fowl people. And there are people who don't like living pets at all. They simply want a pet rock. So I'll call them rock people. So my first question is, what kind of person are you? You only can choose one of those 5, and you must choose one of those 5. Pick A, B, C, D, or E based on how you see yourself. And this is how Poll Everywhere works. As each one of you gives an answer, it will change the perspectives in that. 80% of you are dog people, 83% now, and 17 are cat people. There's another feature that I have for this when I'm doing a really large group, and it has the number of respondents, and then it gives all the actual data. We can have all kinds of things. But my system does not track which phone gave which answer. It's important for you to know that. Now, I didn't put a timer on. Sometimes I put timers on so it cuts off and then you can't answer. There is a way to change your answer. So if you want to type in the word undo, U-N-D-O, no space, undo, it will take whatever answer your phone sent in, it will take that off, and then you can pick a different answer. So somebody pick E or C or whatever, anything else. And then you can undo that and put your, 50% of you, you all picked foul people. So that's how Poll Everywhere works. And when we have a really large group, I've done this with hundreds of people before, and to see the charts go up and down, they have circular charts and the numbers. It's really, really interesting to see how they go. So what I want to do is do a second question. If you need your acnestus scratched, what part of your body is going to get scratched? Is it on your shoulder? Is the acnestus on your feet? Is your acnestus on your private part somewhere? And we're not going to go any further than that. Is it on your back? Or is it on your nose? You need your acnestus scratched, and it might very well be that you just have to guess at an answer. Oh, and this does the actual numbers. 3 of you thought it was on the nose. 2 thought it was on the back. Only 5 of you have answered so far, and it might be 1 or 2 people. There you go. Somebody said shoulder. So that's how the poll everywhere works. What happens is, in my system, it will record the graphs, but not who said what. So as we go along, you'll see that that's quite important. The acnestis is actually the part of your back that neither hand can reach. It's that right there. That's called the acnestis. All right. One of the things that I like to do when we're dealing with an issue of this nature is to look at the big scene first. We're talking about anxiety, and sometimes anxiety is extremely intense, and sometimes it's very low-key, sometimes just starting, and sometimes it rolls on for a long time. So the concept of anxiety in and of itself is broad territory. But what I want to do is kind of lay out the whole map of the land first so that we can focus on that particular concept. In the way that I teach an understanding of reality, I teach in the complex of perceptions. We have 10 of them. When you're in elementary school, you are taught that there are 5 senses: sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch. And those are the 5 kind of core senses. And that's true. You pick up the world around you through those 5 senses. But we teach that there are 5 more senses than that. Vestibular is in your inner ear, and it's actually a sense organ that tells you when you're balanced, when you're moving forward or falling backwards, when your body is not stable. So you can be unstable. Your vestibular system says, I got it, I know where I am, I'm balanced or not. So it doesn't always have to be that you're erect. When you're laying down, your vestibular system knows that. The problem is when your vestibular system gets off, you can be laying down but thinking you're standing up. Or you can be leaning forward, but your brain is telling you that you're leaning backwards. And so that becomes a sense organ, very, very important. The 7th one is called proprioceptive, and it's your skeleton tells you where you are in space. You don't have to do this now, but one of the ways they test for proprioceptive skill that is declining in older adults, or anybody, is to have you close your eyes, put one hand out with your finger pointing the opposite direction of your hand, with your eyes closed, put the other hand out in which your skeleton says, my fingers should touch, and then try and touch them. And you find that most often you're off by an inch or more. Even though your brain is saying, my skeleton is exactly in line, it actually isn't. Your proprioceptive system is not that well defined. But it becomes a real problem when an older person can't lift their feet high enough, but their brain says they are lifting their feet high enough to get up a step. Or even worse, when you're going down and your brain, your body skeletal system is saying, my foot should be on the ground by now, but it's an inch and a half off. And so the proprioceptive system, extremely important for understanding where you are in reality. The 8th system, we say, is actually a perception system, your memory. You'll be able to I have been in this, we helped build this place. I know it's above the ceiling. I know it's behind every door, every wall, everywhere. But some of you might not know exactly what's inside that room, but my memory tells me what's there. So I have a perception of something in other places in this building that you can't have because you have no memory of that being there. So memory is a perception sense of what reality is around you. The 9th one is imagination or creativity, and that is you can imagine something happening without it actually, quote, being real. But for you, it becomes a reality. So imagination or creativity is the 9th sense. And the 10th one is spirituality, the spiritual sense of the heavenly realm, of the presence of God, hearing God's voice, interacting with things that are spiritual is a 10th sense. I've talked with people who make the claim that they're atheists, that they have researched this, they've really thought about it, they've done all the scientific examination, and they have become convinced in their mind there is nothing to the spiritual world. And my response to that is, I have a friend who's colorblind. And if I wear a bright red vest at Christmas time and I say, do you like my bright red vest? And my friend says, gray like everything else. I said, no, this is red. It really is red. Let me testify to the color. Nah, there's no color. I looked, there's nothing to it. So an atheist is a person whose spiritual sense has simply gone inert or doesn't even exist. So the 10 senses combine so that we can have a perception of reality and what is going on in the world and our part in it. The second complex is emotions, and my whole doctoral work was on the concept that there are 5 emotional drivers. I'll talk about that a little bit more completely in just a moment. But the 5 emotions, there's lots of variation between low intensity and high intensity, and we have different words, but as a child begins to grow, Levi has no words for emotion, none at all. But we know he can get angry. We know he can be sad. We know he can be happy. He can feel those emotions, but he has no words for them at all. Colton, at the age of 4, has several words in there, but not real highly refined. They're not complex words. And as a person grows older, they gain greater language to differentiate between mild emotions, moderate emotions, and intense emotions. But that's not always true of every single adult. There are adults who have 2, 3 words max for each emotional system, and they jump quickly from one to the next because that's the way their understanding works. So the complex of emotions, we teach that there are 5 of them. The third complex, I call them complex like a building, like you go into a mall, and that's a complex of facilities and pathways, and it's really not just a single room or a single building, it's a complex. That's why I use that word. A complex of motivations, we teach that there are 5 drivers by which we get from our perceptions to our behaviors. And I'm not going to go into that tonight. There's a lot of information on that. But the level of motivations differ. The 5 drivers differ in how fluid they are. A thought or an idea is very flexible. It can be changed relatively easily. But a value is much more solid, much less likely to change. And what we call culture or identity is like bedrock. It does not change at all. One of the things I find very fascinating in the discussions that happen on Facebook or on social media is that at times people will present an idea as if it's flexible or fluid, but it's actually bedrock for them. They are not going to move or change no matter what you say, how you say it, or what's going on in the world. They will always reinterpret information in line with their culture because it is so immovable. And then people will wonder, why can't we have a discussion and it's worse at the end than it was at the beginning? Because you're addressing matters of a person's culture with words or ideas or thoughts or opinions. So motivations is a big, big area to study. Then the last one is behaviors, and of course there are hundreds of billions of options in behaviors. We teach that there are two behavioral pathways. One pathway is to engage an action, to do something. It's a choice to act. But the other pathway is to disengage, not to act, to choose not to do something, not to say something. One of the ways I was kind of working through, how do we say this stuff? I was walking on a prayer walk with other clergy here in town, and as we were going down the sidewalk, there was some garbage that had flown into the pathway, crumpled newspapers and some sticks and other stuff that was laying in the pathway. And 3 or 4 of the clergy ahead of me either stepped over or walked around it. And I stopped and picked it up and put it in a trash can that was off the pathway down a driveway about 15 feet. And as we came back to the walk, one of the other clergy said, "Can I ask you a question?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Why did you do that?" I said, I have friends in this town that are in wheelchairs, electric wheelchairs, and that would block their path. It would mean they could not be on the pathway. So rather than just step over it or walk away, I do something about that. I engage in my action. And as soon as I said that, I thought, that's what the others did, is they disengaged. They saw it, they could have picked it up, but they didn't. Now, it's not always good to engage and always wrong to disengage. At times, when you see somebody with new clothing or new hairdo or that you haven't seen in a bit and they say, oh, it's so good to see you, what do you think of my new clothes? And you disengage what you really think, which is socially very nice. You don't necessarily always want to say everything that pops in your mind or act out everything you want to do. So the concept of engagement and disengagement becomes part of how you function in reality. And so we'll be talking about some of these concepts as we go through tonight's basic information. So there are 4 distinct complexes, and we can talk about them as if they're totally separated. In the same way that we can talk about your arterial system and your pneumatic system, your lungs, your heart and your lungs. We say those are different systems, but they're impossible to separate. They actually, your nervous system is integrated with your digestive system and your muscular system and your skeletal system. We can talk about them separately, but in reality, they're integrated. That's very important to understand. So when we analyze or discuss or pull an idea out of one of the 4 complexes, it's vital to understand that it's actually an integrated system. All of them are actually working together. Here's a good example of perception. If you see this very strange UFO flying over the heads of people that are kind of oblivious to what's going on, but flip the picture the other way and you see, oh, it's actually a photograph of a car in a pond. And it really had to do with how you were perceiving it, not what its reality was. So the final picture we came up with is the 4 heads interactively blended with each other in every way. The yellow head, perceptions, actually interacts with emotions and changes the emotion based on your perception. So your ears hear words, but it also hears tone of voice. And it also hears hesitation. Very fine details. And then when your memory interacts with that slight bit of hesitation, your emotions can fire up, and now you listen differently than you did before. It's the emotion changing your perception. That's how that becomes interactive. When your motivations, when you say, I'm going to express my opinion, next time my family gets together, I am laying down the law, I am saying what needs to be said, so your motivations will change your emotions. You may be thrilled at the idea of doing that, and you may be terrified at the idea of doing that, and that's going to change the way in which you behave. So once you start blurting something out and you've gone too far, now your emotions interact with your behaviors, which interact with your perceptions, which interact with your motivations. When things get complicated, that's when I say, okay, let's back up a little bit and talk about just the perceptions part of this, or just the motivations part of this. Let's pull that out and look at that area carefully so that we can analyze one particular part. In the area of these 4 then, the complex of perceptions, the complex of emotions, the complex of motivations, and complex of behaviors, the question arises for us as we're analyzing and examining, considering, and working on anxiety is, where do we put anxiety? So I want you to vote. Is anxiety, in your view, in the way in which you function in the world, is it primarily a perception, a lens of perception? Is it primarily an emotion? Is it primarily a motivational driver? Is it primarily a behavior? Or I really don't know what anxiety is. I use the word, I feel anxious, but I really don't know what it is. So give a vote there. Now what's interesting is, any of those three answers, and even behavior, is not a wrong answer. They're all correct answers because they're your answers. So if I say I'm functioning with anxiety being an emotion, and I'm going to look at it in the 5 emotional drivers, but your understanding of anxiety is it's a motivational driver. It's part of how I'm wired to drive. When we're talking about conflicts that arise from anxiety, it's important for me to take your understanding, not push mine on you. That's true when you're working with children or with parents or with others in the environment, is to understand how does that person understand what we're talking about. So in my system, I deal with anxiety primarily as an emotion, but it can be any of those 4, even when a person says, I'm using a word, but I don't even know really what I mean by that. I know the feelings inside, I know what I do, I know that I'm not fitting in real well, but I don't actually know what's going on for me. And that's one of the reasons why we do a workshop like this, is to be able to adjust and refine and make more precise our understanding. But always bear in mind, even though my conversation will start out that it's an emotion, if that's not your reality, then in other interactions, I would discover that and I would shift my view towards yours. If we take the complex of emotions, when I did my doctoral work, this is about 20 years ago now, or close to it, I was working with my advisors, and I said, I've read a lot of psychology, and I've read a lot of counseling, and I've read a lot of intervention, a lot of professional stuff, and I can't seem to find any definition of emotion that everyone agrees with. And as I studied through all of those various aspects, I found out there is no accepted single definition of an emotion. None. Freud had one, Rogers had one, Anderson had one. Every psychologist and theorist and behavioralist had their own definition of what emotion was. So eventually my advisor said, make up your own definition and sell it to people. Let them know what you think an emotion is and how emotions work, and you become your own expert. There is no standard. So even looking in dictionaries, the dictionaries kind of fudge around the idea and make some vague commentaries about how emotions function, but they never say what it is. Inside the human brain, we can analyze the tissue. When a person is dead, we can look at the neurons under a microscope, but you cannot see a thought. You cannot see an emotion. You can't actually see a hormone or how it works. There's no way to see the thought. It's in there somewhere, but nobody knows exactly. Is it electrical? Is it chemical? Is it an interaction of electrical and chemical? Is it something else? Is it physical where nerves touch each other? Is that where the idea or the concept of the memory is? When you smell cinnamon and you remember your grandmother's cottage and what it actually tastes like on a cold morning with hot chocolate, where is that? What's going on that makes that happen? And no one knows. When a person becomes angry or frustrated or sad, and that sadness becomes very intense based on perceptions where a relative dies and you're moderately sad, but you see a cat get killed and you're overwhelmed. Where's that going on inside your brain? What's happening there? Nobody knows. So I defined emotion as a reaction or a response to a perceived event. A reaction or a response. A reaction for me is unplanned, instantaneous, spontaneous, and a response is conditioned or planned. But it's your way of interacting, what you perceive in preparation for how you're motivated to act, and that results in your action or your suspension of action. So emotion is that response or reaction that occurs inside of you. In the 5 drivers, I hold that there are 5. The first one, I just kind of carved up the head here because they're not in even sections. Acceptance is the emotional system that we would say is love. It's drawing something towards yourself. You like it, you're interested, you're curious. You are bonded to it, you are connected to it, you love it, you cherish it. You're driven towards it, you're craving it, you're addicted to it, you're obsessed with it. Obsession and curiosity are both emotions of acceptance, just at very different levels of intensity. What are you willing to do? How are you willing to act at a very mild level of interest or curiosity or even preference compared to addiction or craving? So you get up at 2:30 in the morning and for some reason you have a hankering for an Italian sausage with peppers and onions. If you're just curious about that or interested, the thought goes through your mind, you have a graham cracker, you go back to bed. That's it. It was just a passing thought. If you really love Italian sausage and you smelled somebody next door barbecuing Italian sausage with peppers and onions earlier in the evening, and your stomach keeps growling, you get up out of bed, you're much more motivated now, you're much more driven by your acceptance to have that Italian sausage. You go through your refrigerator, you find a couple of hot dogs, maybe an old Zweigel or two, and you say, not good enough, but I'll have a Zweigel tonight, and then I'll get Italian sausage tomorrow. But if your craving is incredibly intense, you'll go to an all-night Wegmans, get an Italian sausage, get some peppers and onions, come home, turn your grill on 2:30 or 3 o'clock in the morning. You're going to have that Italian sausage because you absolutely adore, you are obsessed, you are transfixed. So the difference in levels of intensity changes the way you interact with reality. So acceptance is all of those feelings, from very mild through very moderate through very intense. One thing that's extremely important in this entire system is there is no moral value to mild versus intense. It is not better to love intensely than to be mildly curious. They're just different. The problem is we tend to stain love as being automatically good and other emotions as automatically bad. So we don't want to feel the bad emotions. One of the books that I actually studied for my doctoral work was The Bad Emotions. And the bad emotions, according to this author, were anger, fear, and exhaustion or sadness. And the person said, people don't want to feel those feelings. Those are bad feelings. And the whole book was based on we want love and we want joy, but we hate anger, and anger's always bad. And I thought, no, that's not true. Because you can be angry at injustice, violently angry at injustice, and that's the right thing to do. And you can love attention to the point that you have become a megalomaniac. And you drive everyone else out of the picture because you crave, you love that spotlight so much. That's not healthy. So love in and of itself is not automatically good, and anger is not automatically bad. So at low emotion, high emotion just is, and we can talk about the intensity. Second one is exposure. Exposure was an interesting word for me because fear is the kind of child's level word that we use, but fear has to do with to what have you been exposed, what level of danger, what risk, where is your safety or your security compromised or even removed. So the second one is exposure. Again, same thing. There are mild feelings, there's moderate, and there are also intense feelings. The third one I call empowerment. This was the hardest one for me to name because empowerment really is seen as a political statement or a social interactive statement to be empowered to act for yourself and to do better in the world. But anger for me, anger, frustration, annoyance, rage, all those words have to do with shifting the balance of control or bringing about change. If you have young children or have had young children in your home, and by the time they're 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 years old, and you say to them, I want you to go to bed, and they stall, and you get more intense, and they still stall, and then you get more intense, they would say, my mom or my dad's getting angry. And you're feeling more anger, and then you're frustrated, and then you're annoyed, and then you're finally pounding the chair, and finally you stomp your feet and jump out of your chair. And the moment you do something to bring about a change, they head to bed. And the anger is about compelling change or shifting the balance of power. So it's an empowerment issue. And there's mild feelings of empowerment, and there's moderate, and there's very intense. The fourth one is depletion. This actually came out of a conversation with a person in counseling, and the individual said to me, I am feeling very depressed. My doctor says I'm depressed and I should go on antidepressants. What do you think? And I said, I was toying with these ideas. This happened 25 years ago, 30 years ago. And I said, let's try changing the word. And she said, what do you mean changing the word? I said, don't tell me you're depressed. Tell me you're depleted. What? Just start over the conversation. Just tell me you're depleted. So she did. She said, okay, I really am feeling depleted. My doctor thinks. I said, don't tell me what your doctor says. You're really feeling depleted. What tank in your life is dried up? And without missing a moment, her husband had died about a year and something before, and she goes, you know, no one's hugged me in a way that really makes me feel like I'm human since my husband died. And I haven't laughed. I mean, right away she told me 2 tanks that were completely dried up and empty. So I said, before you start antidepressants, now I'm not saying that clinical depression, chemical changes in the brain don't require, but I call that something else. This is the emotion of depletion. I said, let's come up with a plan. Teach 2 or 3 of your friends. Tell them, I need to be hugged this way. Not just everybody you know, but certain people you really trust. And then find 1 or maybe 2 and get some movies from way back that just make you howl with laughter. Let's see what happens. She came back a couple of months later. She said, I'm getting my tanks filled up again. I'm not as depleted as I was. It really had to do with that depletion is natural. It's natural every day. Your hunger increases, your thirst, your body dries out, you need sleep every day. You have to go through those cycles. There are some cycles that are a week long or a month long or even a year long or a lifetime long in which your body and your mind and your heart and your soul depletes and you refill it, or if you don't, you become further depleted until you are empty. So the fourth one, the emotional system, is depletion or sadness. Then the fifth one is celebration, happiness, thrill, joy, anything that causes you to shine or spread out your life. I put gratitude as an emotion there, or generosity, a willingness to share, to be happy, to exude something from your life towards others. So those are the 5: acceptance, exposure, empowerment, depletion, celebration. I put the area of anxiety into the concept, at least to start, of exposure. That it has to do with a loss or a response to danger or risk. That something in your life, as you perceive it, of your safety, your security, your confidence, how you see yourself in the context of reality as you perceive it from all these various immediate 10 senses and your memory and all that stuff all combined. How do you see yourself in that moment relative to the risks and dangers? Now, the reality is risk and danger is a normal part of life. It is. Always is. I'm up on a stage. I'm 16 inches above the floor. I'm at danger of stepping off the stage and not realizing how close to the edge I am. And if I don't pay attention to that and my body isn't aware of falling, I could actually fall and, in theory, break my neck and die. Because the danger is present even when I don't perceive it. At the same token, I could have fallen, wrenched my knee, twisted my shoulder, gotten pain in my neck, and I see any edge and I'm immediately anxious. The anxiety level, my feeling that I'm in danger, is not necessarily based on reality, it's my interaction with reality. And so now I can have incredibly intense feelings that drive my motivations based on my perceptions that have to do with the risk or danger that I'm in. So what I did is I created a little graphic here of what anxiety is, as I want to talk about it tonight. I drew a little odd-shaped piece of the area of exposure. For some people, anxiety is 20% of all of their feelings of exposure all the time. We're going to talk about this in a little bit. But it actually can bleed over into your emotion of anger. That anxiety generates kind of a seething, and you don't know what to do with it, and you really don't know where it comes from. It can actually go over and touch into the depletion area. Every time you feel anxious, you feel exhausted almost immediately. They're tied into each other. So just saying that anxiety is part of exposure is almost too simplistic to being able to understand it and be able to develop an action plan towards it. It can even touch into the area of acceptance. There are some people, I was commenting to Mary before this seminar started, that when I get ready to speak, I have to keep myself from getting too wired up. She goes, well, don't drink so much coffee. I said, it's not about coffee. It's about, my brain works by pictures. I have dyslexia, and so I have pictures. So I have 48 separate slides, some of which are builds. So there's about 75 different pictures. I have all 75 pictures in my head all the time since this afternoon. They're always in there. And what I'm going to say and how I'm going to transition is also always in there. And the reality is that my intensity, let's say I don't call it anxiety, it could come out like anxiety, butterflies in my stomach, a knot in my chest, sweating, not being able to focus. I mean, there's all kinds of things that look just like anxiety. But the reality is that that's part of my thrill of speaking. I enjoy getting wired up like that, even though, and Pam knows this, when I'm done, I'm going to be wiped out for about the next 2 days. Just for speaking to 10 of you or 8 of you, because the way I interact myself with reality as I understand it. So at what point is that anxiety or the enjoyment of the crowd? It's all in the words. It's how you say it and see it and experience it, and that becomes very vital in terms of being able to have a response to deal with it. So I drew that kind of weird picture, and your picture may be very different. You might almost never experience anxiety, and you might frequently experience anxiety. And it may even change its shape and have an entirely different way of working on that. Now, we started a little bit after 6:30. It's been 45 minutes, so you've been sitting very passively, other than those of you who have been taking notes. What I want you to do is stand up for 30 seconds and just get a tiny bit of movement in your body. And there's some cookies back there if you want to grab one of those. I have more stuff up there. We'll do that after a break. Function of exposure, and there are some mild words in that system. I have 45 in the book that I have back there. There's 45 words for every one of the 5, just to give you some language to talk about it. A startle reflex is actually one of the very first human experiences that causes a human being to start breathing. Coming out of the gestational period, you're not breathing, your lungs are filled with a liquid, and in order to start the breathing process, there has to be some kind of startle that causes the lungs to suck in and air begins to go in and out of the lungs. That happens until you die. So startle reflex is usually a reaction, not a response. You don't plan to be startled. It's when somebody comes up behind you and goes boo, or there's a sound or something that happens that causes you to have a startle reaction. That is part of exposure. Shyness and embarrassment, fear and guilt are aspects of a loss of security or safety or a greater danger. But so is shame. It's much more intense than just guilt by itself, to be ashamed. And then terror and panic. A panic attack is anxiety out of control. It cannot be reined in. It's now functioning all on its own, taking over all of your systems and creating an environment in which the level of danger or risk is now beyond a person's ability to manage it. And so the issue here is not stop feeling panic, but bring panic down where it's not taking over everything and it becomes just simply manageable anxiety or something along that line. So I created a quadrilateral, what I call a quadrilateral, so we can talk a little bit more specifically about the concept of anxiety, what you see in others. One of the things Pam wanted me to have you do is to say, how do you see this in children you're working with or in their families, and be able to start addressing it or talking to it. So I created a quadrilateral. The top of the quadrilateral is its source. What is the source of the anxiety? And the second quadrilateral, second side, is the timing of that anxiety. So under source, one source of anxiety is purely biological. It is something happening in your body, and a psychotherapist or a medical doctor would be able to analyze. There are illnesses, conditions, diseases, and wirings in certain people, no matter how much yoga you do, no matter how you rest, what you eat, it does not matter. The sense of anxiety still is persistent because you're biologically wired differently than a person who doesn't experience that. So biological is one. And then mental is in terms of emotion, in terms of thought, in terms of training, habit, experience. That's the actual source of the anxiety. So the one, biological, is only addressed by a biological means. You must change what you eat, you start taking medication, you drop other medication. There are medications that actually increase anxiety. You have your heart rhythm corrected. Whatever the biological source of that anxiety is, you address it biologically. If you have bad eyes, you wear glasses. Nobody debates that. If you have a broken arm, you put a cast on. Nobody debates that. If you have biologically sourced anxiety, you can deal with that in terms of biological medications or in that kind of way. If it's mental, then it's a matter of training, of learning, of thought process, and there are all kinds of ways of dealing with that. In terms of timing, anxiety can be incidental. That is, it's based on an incident. It is temporal, temporary. It occurs in certain situations, and it does not occur in other situations. There is biological, incidental anxiety that could be caused by something you eat. You're actually allergic to it, but instead of getting hives or throwing up, your response is feelings of anxiety because of what you're eating and how that's interacting with your body. So every time you eat that, you're going to have a bout of anxiety. One can be biological, that when you get overtired, you hit a tipping point. When you get overtired, that incident is what can create unmanageable anxiety. But when you're not overtired, it doesn't ever occur. So it can be incidental. And then the other one is, it is continual. It is something that is persistent, and it is a function of the normal way in which you live. So section 1 would be anxiety is biological, but for me, it's incidental. It's not something that's a function of my emotions or my thinking, or it's something biologically wired into me, but it only occurs on incidental times. The second one, number 2, is it's biological and it's continual. It is, I am persistently an anxious person, or the child that I'm working with is persistently anxious. They're wired that way. You can look at all kinds of reasons why that might be. The third area is that it is mental for me. It's my emotion. It is something in my conditioning. It's part of my history and my response to my history, but it's incidental. When I see a certain person from my family or my past, I have these incredible feelings of anxiety, but as soon as I walk away from that person or I'm out of that situation, I'm no longer anxious. And then the fourth one would be, it is mental and it is continual. It's persistent, and it can be dealt with in counseling, in prayer, in meditation, in all kinds of means by that. So here's what I want you to do. Take your phone again, and you can vote, I think, as many times as you want. You can pick number one, it's biological and incidental. It's biological and continual. It's mental and continual. It's mental and incidental. And for you, 2 or 3 or even all 4 of those may actually be true. The issue is not what's right. The issue is what's true, what's real. as we look at addressing matters of anxiety, recognizing that all 4 of these conditions can be in play. It is not morally right or wrong. It's not better or worse. It just simply is what's real for you, how do you perceive it, and what's your interaction with that as a person. So mental and incidental, occasional anxiety, you might see that in children. When you're in a playroom and there are 3 children there, you'll have a particular child that never exhibits any anxiety at all. Add a 4th child, that person immediately explodes with anxiety. So if you observe those kind of things, you'll say, I can see the environment triggers something. I don't exactly know what yet, but I see the trigger happen. And it could be a child, we see this and we comment about this with our grandchildren, when there is one child interacting with any other one child, they're all fine. Add a second child, something changes in the dynamic. It's just the presence of that third person, a triangulation that begins to create an intensity that's kind of out of whack. So looking at that, now we have some data that we can work with in terms of talking through how does this play out in terms of who we are and what do we do with it. So the anxiety quadrilateral becomes one way. This is certainly not thorough and absolutely complete about all anxiety levels. But being able to say, you know, this could be generated by something biological in the person. What did they eat? For when we were teenagers or young adults, red dye number 5 became this horrific thing that was added to foods. And for 90% or more of the population, red dye number 5 had absolutely no impact on them at all. None. But for 10% of the population, red dye number 5 triggered something really intense inside their lives. They just got totally out of control, or they were totally wired up, or whatever it was. The outcomes were not necessarily the exact same outcome for every person. But they finally figured out there's a biological factor that is predictable of what is going on in terms of the anxiety or the anger level or the intensity that is going on. And we can deal with that by eliminating. Now, 30 years later, they're beginning to remove all dyes, and it's in almost everything. My regular tube of toothpaste from Crest ran out a couple of weeks ago, and so I've gotten all these little sample tubes. They're really weird things. And one of them is a Crest natural whitener. And so when I opened the tube and squeezed it out, it's like a pale gray. Like, I don't want to put that in my mouth. But on the backside it says, no colorings added. And then I thought, wait a minute, my regular Crest toothpaste has colorings added? What did they do to make it so blue? Well, of course, they added color. So what's interesting is there's a movement now not to add red dye on apples to make them look blue, not to color oranges. And a natural color orange isn't really orange. So it's all been colored, and we have that kind of thing influencing our culture. Meats have colorings added to them. I mean, virtually everything has some kind of coloring in it. And they're beginning to realize that actually does impact all of our systems. And for some people, that interaction is extremely intense. So being able to understand that. Some is mental, and having mental anxiety is not bad. It's a function of conditioning. It's a function of perception. It's how you see yourself in reality and what it is that is inciting that anxiety in you. So my next slide for you to interact with allows you to type in an answer. And I think you can type in as many as you want, so you can put in more than one. What is the first feeling you have that signals your anxiety is beginning to increase? Everyone has a feeling. What would that feeling be that signals to you my anxiety is beginning to increase? What is that first feeling? So type in a word or two. It won't let you do a text message. That's tragic. It's supposed to. It did for me earlier. What does it say? There's a little... No responses received yet. They will appear here. What's that? It says poll does not support text message. Yes, it did. Oh, my goodness. Okay. So, anyone want to say one out loud? Fear. Huh? Fear. Fear. That you become furtive. Something is increasing. So, biologically, what's the feeling of fear? What do you begin to... Your heart rate begins to increase. That can be a real immediate signal that anxiety or stress is starting to happen. That's a good one. And you start to look around for a way out. It's very interesting because your eyes will move at a certain pace, and if all of a sudden you start looking around faster, if you're aware of that, your feedback to yourself, I'm starting to look around, that can be a signal that your anxiety is increasing. You start looking around faster. That's a good one. Feeling exhausted when it's not a function of depletion, when it's actually an expression of anxiety. That is, I'm just getting tired. And interestingly, when a situation seems to pose danger, one of the ways you can deal with that is crawl under the covers or get sick. When anxiety begins to increase, you can actually catch a cold or get sick to your stomach and say, I got to go to bed. And now you're out of danger because you're in your bed. Shortness of breath is when you feel a knot in the center of your stomach. That can be a sign, early sign of anxiety increasing. Sweaty palms or dry palms, dry mouth, or over saliva in your mouth. For different people, the trigger or the symptom of the trigger is going to be different. It's important for you and to observe in children that you're working with, what are their common early symptoms of anxiety when it begins to happen. It can be upset stomach, it can be pacing, it can be ringing in the ears. I mean, there are going to be all kinds of things. What? Bursting into tears, right? As a symptom not of sadness, but of an increase in anxiety. So the whole point of, oh, look at that, they're coming in. What are they? I'm putting them in for them. Oh, you're putting them out. So it's really interesting. When I do a seminar like this for 200 people, the answers come flying in. And if 5 people put exhaustion, that word gets bigger and bigger and bigger. It's very, very, very interesting to see that happen. So that was what I was hoping would happen for this. And when I tested it, it was actually working. So I'm not sure why. Even very young children, even as young as Levi, if he begins to get anxious, he'll have certain behaviors. His hands might start moving, or he might pull his hands in. The issue is not, is it better to have your hands moving around or to have your hands pull in? It is, what does Levi do when he starts getting anxious? How do I recognize that? How do I help him recognize that, or any child that I happen to be working with? Okay, so let's see if there's another one. What age can a child feel anxiety? This is A, B, C, D, or E, so you should be able to. A is immediately after birth. B is 6 months or so. C is when they have words to express it. D is before they're born. E is when they're teenagers, and no person feels anxiety before they are a teenager. This is really an interesting aspect of science, because there is not a definitive answer as to whether or not preborn people feel what we would call anxiety, and then others will say that they do. And so that becomes really, really interesting to see. Nobody thinks it's as late as when they have words. Right after birth, 6 months or so, and even before they're born. So what's interesting is there is a legitimate debate as to is there an early, extremely early conditioning that sets a person towards anxiety and exposure, or reduces that down, and then other feelings become more dominant? And the reason why I'm asking this is not because there's a right answer to it. It is, be observant and aware that some of these feelings of great anxiety and fear can have been going on perhaps even before a person was born. Let's see if there's another word cloud that will work here. I don't know if it will or not. What can you observe that signals anxiety might be rising in a child that you're working with? You're working with staff and children. What would be an example of something showing a child, not an adult, a child is beginning to have anxiety feelings? Crying and yelling? Ooh, hiding. Are you typing all those in, or are you typing those in? Okay, because it worked when I did the test beforehand. It worked. What else do you say then? Throwing things, or striking out in anger, what appears to be anger, and you may want to say, don't be so angry, but it's not about being angry. It's feeling anxiety that they don't have words for and they don't know how to manage. So that can be a big one. Yeah, hitting other people. Biting. For people, especially for children who their brains don't immediately come up with words for what they're trying to say. They may be verbal people, but their brain doesn't automatically go to a word choice. It goes to an action choice. And if the action is to hurt someone or drive them away, biting can be a very early sign that anxiety is beginning to increase. So that would be true. So looking for ways in which the children that are in your life or in your care begin to experience anxiety, and it will be different for their sadness and it'll be different for their anger, but instead of having one blanket fits everybody, beginning to understand that it can be different for different people, and that they may have their own triggers and their own symptoms that come out. So we have a few minutes left. Let's look at some best practices relative to the anxiety quadrilateral that we want to be able to do. And this is by no means a complete list, and we could probably spend another hour talking about this. Number one, affirm the expression or action of a feeling without criticizing a child. To see something begin to happen and say, what's wrong with you, is a criticism. But to affirm the action, if a child says, they're not necessarily going to say, I feel anxious right now, especially a 4 or 5, 6-year-old kid. They're not going to do that. I feel anxious. They'll say, I don't like this. Say, I understand that. I hear what you say. You don't. Just repeat what they said back. You don't like this. You can inquire without making an assumption. I was watching a little bit of a video that came up relative to this particular issue, and the scene that was being depicted was a child who was coming home from soccer practice, and the child said, I'm no good, I'm the worst kid on the team, I'm going to quit. And the person doing the video said, there's 2 ways you can approach that. You can say, no, you're really good. I think you're the best on the team. I think you're really doing a great, great job. And that is the worst thing possible to say. Because what you're saying to the child is your feelings are a lie, and I don't believe you. So instead of that, inquire without making an assumption. Tell me what you're feeling. Can you describe it for me? And which is simply to say, I hear what you're saying, and it's valid. Now, I might not think that's true, but what I think isn't important here. It's what that child is thinking and feeling. And so to being able to make an inquiry without making an assumption is a best practice. Third is to observe without prejudice. Without prejudice, that is, without automatically assuming you know what's going on. That's really hard to do, especially when you're in charge of a room full of people. Being able to observe without prejudice is to know the charges that you have and what's normal for them, what their normal intensity level is, their morning routines, whatever it happens to be. When that starts to change or has an incidental change, take note of that in your mind without prejudice. Don't immediately assume, oh, the child is angry, the child is depressed, the child is fighting, but be able to observe those changes in normal behavior and then keep that in mind for that particular child. Report what's going on with permission unless there's danger, and Pam can actually refine this a little bit better relative to staff. Well, we report with permission. When a child who's not your own child, even when they are, makes a report about an emotion, you can ask that child, is it all right with you if I tell some other person about that? Can I talk to your mom about that? Ask for permission to do that. And this is, again, best practices. Sometimes you can't do that. If you see something happening that actually creates a present danger, you must act and report without going through that process. But this is a discovery part that you're able to say, may I, even to a 4-year-old or a 3-year-old, I would like to talk to your mom about that or your dad about that. Is that okay with you? And what it says is, I trust you as a person and you have respect in my eyes. That becomes very important in the process. Next one, fifth one, I actually combined these two together and I probably should have separated them. Name what is the experience. Name their feeling for them and have a buddy experience it with them. One of the things that really deals very, very well with anxiety is to have someone else who's standing with me now, just being there. When I went through pastoral training, one of the matters that came up early on was spending time with people who had had surgery or death was coming. They were experiencing the onset of death. And one of the guys in the class said, so what good does it really do for us to sit there hour after hour after hour while somebody's dying? I mean, you go in and pray and talk with them and then figure it out later. And the response was, there is something about presence. You don't have to say anything. Just being present changes the dynamic of how everyone is experiencing the moment. And sometimes when an individual experiences increasing anxiety or it's getting beyond, the panic level is starting to occur, being able to say, I am here with you. Nothing more needs to be said. Getting through and naming it and having a buddy go through it. Another technique that's really a good one is whenever it is possible, especially with young children, instead of staying eye above, get down to eye level and be at their experience level. I'm here right now. You do not need to be afraid. I know you might be feeling, or they've said that they're afraid or they're anxious, and you can get down to eye level when it is possible to do that. Gentle touch, especially when it's appropriate. This is very, very difficult in today's world. When do you touch? How do you touch? What does it mean? Do you give a hug? Do you not give a hug? Do you hold their shoulder? Do you stroke their head? They're very, very complicated issues. But in human experience, when anxiety begins to become incredibly intense, the human skin-to-skin touch is calming for almost everybody. Not everybody, but that's a very, very good best practice. And then to have some actual follow-up when you've seen or had a day very intense, anxiety's out of control, any emotion is out of control. The next day say, how are you feeling today? As opposed to, did you calm yourself down? Did you get over it? Those are accusatory statements. But tell me how you're feeling today. And it says to the child, your feelings matter to me, and I remember, and it matters to me. And so now follow up if you can with possible. Now let's see if we have other best practices. And again, I was hoping for a word cloud. Are there other things that I didn't list? I listed 8, but there are many, many ways in which you can help a person get a grip on or resolve their anxiety. I don't know if your phones will work or not. Or best practice, Mary. You can make yourself available for future anxiety. Yes, that's a good one. Yep.
That's like long term.
Sure.
They can count on somebody.
No, very good. Very true.
Remove them.
You can, yeah, and when it's appropriate to do that, to either isolate or specialize, I'm going to go to this other room to do something. Could you come and help me? Allows that child to get out without being punished. I want you to be in timeout because you're so anxious. If you're sensing that anxiety is beginning to increase, and to be able to say, I'm going to do this other activity, would you come with me? Is a way of doing presence without having that be punitive. So that's a good one. Remove them from the situation, the sense of danger or risk that they might feel that they are in, as a way of saying this is helpful to you. It's a good one. Anything else?
What about like maybe redirecting them at that time to like something that might be fun for them at that moment?
Or at least diversionary. It could be more fun. It could be something that gets them off the focus of what is stimulating that level of anxiety so that they think about something else. Redirecting, that's a good one. Oh, we're a couple of minutes away from 8. There are 2 questions that we ask a lot. One is, what is this stimulus, situation, relationship, what is it doing to me? How am I engaging this? How am I being affected by this? As I see reality, what does that do to me? And what can I do with it? What do I do about it? How do I take my next step? What is my next action to either engage or to disengage? And that changes the dynamic all along. We are right at 8 o'clock. Does anybody have a question or a response before we tie things up? I said we would be done by 8, and we will be done by 8. And we could do training on this topic for weeks. We really could. To get out of the system, type leave into your phone, L-E-A-V-E. Here we go, leave to 22333. You're actually in the system and locked into it, so type leave. And as soon as I turn the PowerPoint off, you'll leave anyway. It disengages you. So thank you for coming. Yes? I think thinking through the quadrilateral, is this biologically generated or is it mentally generated, emotionally generated? Is this something persistent or is this something incidental? And so, and you can even ask about that. How long has this been going on? Your feelings of anxiety right now, how long has this been your experience? Is this something you deal with every day? Or is this something that is triggered somehow? Can you describe that? The asking questions that are answerable by yes or no or I don't know are the least helpful answers, or least helpful questions. A question that's open-ended that has no right or wrong answer. It allows a person to express, even in fumbling words, what they're trying to say they're experiencing, and that's okay. And even if they say, I just feel terrible, you say, that's okay. It's okay. All human beings feel terrible. And I want you to know I'm all right with that. In certain places in the world, it's not all right to have intense feelings. And to be able to affirm that it's okay is a big step in the one direction. A second one is simply the affirmation, I am here with you. And let's walk through this together. You might not be able to say what you're feeling or why right now, but you might tomorrow or next week. And as you think that through and you want someone to kind of bounce it off of, even if you're screaming, I'm here for that. What it says is, I'm affirming who you are in the context of what you're experiencing, but the affirmation is for you. And in some situations, and again, we live in a very, very complicated world, to be able to say, can I give you a hug right now? Or would you like a hug? Would a hug be helpful to you right now? And some people say, no, don't touch me. Or yes, I would. And then the hug lingers too long. And you can say, I'm done hugging right now. Just where you are. And so, but understanding the dynamics of those can be very, very intense. But affirming, one of the challenges is we're so likely in our world to make an expression that has judgment attached to it. What's wrong with you? Why did you do that? Or something of that nature. And what that does is, especially when a feeling like anxiety is extremely intense, being able to approach that with affirmation without criticism is a hard skill to do. But that's probably the easiest. If you have to have a standard answer, I'm here. It's okay. And that works. Good question. So we've recorded this, and Pam said that for those of you who watched, I have a test for you, but everybody else gets an A. Thank you so much for coming. Oh, I have one more cartoon for you. The Christmas stocking says, I'm telling you, there's nothing worse than being stuffed with candy and hung on a mantle. And he's saying that to a piñata. Anyway, these are my prayers. You can turn that down.